Welcome to Follow Your Curiosity. Ordinary people, extraordinary creativity. Here's how to get unstuck. I'm your host, creativity coach Nancy Norbeck. Let's go. Author Rahna Reiko Rizzuto wrote the way many of us do as a child and teen, but didn't truly turn to writing until she discovered, at the age of 30, that her Japanese-American mother and her family had been stripped of everything and put in an internment camp during World War II. The book she produced in her quest to understand these events, Why She Left Us, won the National Book Award. Her two subsequent books, Hiroshima in the Morning and Shadow Child, continue to explore themes of war, race, and historical blindness. Reiko also teaches writing. We met when she became my first faculty advisor in the Goddard College MFA program in 2007. We talk about Reiko's start as a writer, including that pivotal discovery and the quest to learn more, her time in Japan just before and after 9/11 as she sought to learn from survivors of the Hiroshima bombing, and how 9/11 changed their willingness to speak, and how she taught herself to write and teaches her students those same techniques. Here's my conversation with Reiko Rizzuto. Reiko, welcome to Follow Your Curiosity.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So I start everybody off with the same question, which is, were you a creative kid or did you discover your creative side later on?
I think I was a creative kid. I grew up in this really small town in Hawaii. We didn't have television. There was no movie theater. If you wanted to have a show, basically you'd have to put on a show. So there was a theater in town where the community put on a show, and I usually got the kid role. So there was that. But I think it was a place where I had to make up my own stories and listen to my own voice if I wanted to hear a voice. So I think I started writing, making up kids' stories that I would read to my sister and brother, or writing bad poetry by the waterfall when I was a teenager, that kind of stuff. Just to hear my own voice, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. So did your parents have any thoughts about that? Were they encouraging? Were they like, yeah, whatever, she's got nothing better to do, so fine? Or you should be doing something better with your time, Reiko?
No, because see, they were both writers in their own way. They wrote and did other things. My father wrote fishing articles and math books, and my mother wrote about Hawaii pathfinders and cookbooks. And so we were very much a family about words and about stories. So I think that they thought it was fine. They probably thought it was better than, breaking my arm or drowning in the ocean or something like that. So as long as I was fine. One of the things that they did get on me a lot about, though, was reading. I read everything. I read everything I could possibly find. We would go to the library once a week, and I would bring a huge stack of books in, and I would take a huge stack of books out. And when I was 13, 14, we did this. We flew to the mainland. I grew up on the Big Island of Hawaii, so anything east of us was the mainland. And we got we took a trip across the country, and I think at that time we had a van that we were pulling a pop-up trailer with. And I sat in the back of the van and I read all the way across the country, and they would say, "Look at the Grand Canyon." And I'd be like, "Yeah, I'm reading." look at this or that or the other thing. And half the time I would not get out of the van. And that was, I got a lot of flack for that. I still do.
You were a little too successful with the read all the time thing.
I think so. And I got, really engaged in the stories. I loved them, and I was in the middle of them. And, it's like the Grand Canyon didn't come up, after the cliffhanger of the chapter. So I had to get there.
Yeah.
It was poorly timed.
I'm laughing because I totally get that, because I think, I was largely that kind of kid. They didn't have to worry about me on the road trip because they'd hand me a couple of books and I'd be fine. And every once in a while, my mom would say, "Don't forget to look up every so often," because she was afraid I'd get car sick. And I was just like, yeah, whatever, I'm fine. Never had an issue with being car sick.
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, whatever. Okay, look, it's a road. It's got signs. Yay. But yeah,
And the worlds in those stories are fascinating, and they're just as real as the world around you. I think for me, because we were traveling across the country, and I didn't get to have my big stack of books from the library, and the years before Kindle, we would stop at gas stations, and they would have like a pick a book, take a book kind of thing.
Oh, cool.
So I was getting Robert Ludlum, and I was getting Jaws, and I was getting things that were maybe a little more risque than my parents knew they were. But like I was just reading anything. I mean, tons of science fiction, tons of like spy stories. So that was interesting too, because that's how I kind of came to appreciate the many different kinds of worlds and the many different voices in stories. So it wasn't just like, read the appropriate thing about, the girl who first gets her period, or, something like that. It was a big, big universe of story.
Yeah. How long did it take you guys on this trip? Because I'm just trying to imagine how many things you inhaled as you were.
We went all the way across the country. It took about a month. We went up the West Coast, and then we kind of went back and forth through Canada and the upper states, and then down the other side. And then it was my father's sabbatical. So we stayed for a year, and then on the way back, I think it was 10 days across just the middle of the country to get away. And then prior to that, I think we had one summer. But just basically, whenever I got into the car, I read.
I totally get it. I had forgotten how much I did that as a kid.
Yeah, that's how you become a writer, right?
Yeah. And my mom still does, even if it's like, the 5-minute trip to the grocery store. She's got her Kindle out and she's reading, driving my dad crazy because he wants to have a conversation. And yeah, so it must be at least partially genetic.
Yeah.
So when did you start to take writing seriously?
Oh, the question is, do I take writing seriously? So, I mean, I think when I was a kid, I did a lot of writing for myself. And as I said, I wrote a lot of poetry and bad stories. When I was still in high school, there was a literary magazine, and I became the editor of the literary magazine. But then when I went to college, I thought, well, what am I going to study? I don't know. I had no idea and no real interest. But I knew that I didn't want to study English. I don't even know if you could study writing in those days as a major, because I figured I knew English, so why, And so I mean, felt like a waste. So I ended up studying astrophysics in college.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
I also remember blowing my mind when I first found that out.
Well, this is a quick tangent, but just to explain it, on the Big Island of Hawaii, where I grew up, there's a Mauna Kea. At the top of Mauna Kea, there's a science preserve, and at the time they had 2 or 3 telescopes. I think they've got like 7 or 8 now. But so I worked on a telescope at one summer, and it was just wonderful and fascinating. And I sat in the telescope and I took pictures of the sky, and it was cool. So I thought, well, I'll just learn this. I don't think I thought I would be an astronomer. But it was something to discover. But so then kind of writing went on the back burner. And when I got out of school, I went to work for a publishing company. And I was working in the publicity department with some really, really big name people. And so I didn't write at all, because you're with Toni Morrison and Vidya Naipaul and Robert Stone and all these people who, are such incredible writers. It's like, well, what am I going to do? So it wasn't really until I was 30 that I decided I had a story. And what happened was there was this big family secret that was kind of also a national secret, which was about the Japanese American incarceration. And when I kind of learned about that and my connection to that, and the fact that basically it was like I learned 2 sentences and then that was it. like I needed to find out more. And that's when I started, that's when I decided, oh, I could write a book. Like I could, there was something worth writing about. So it wasn't just like, yes, I can make sentences, but I can make sentences that are interesting to me, useful to me, urgent to me. So I guess I would say that, and that was when I was about 30.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we should probably let people know that your mother is Japanese and your father is Italian, which must have made for an interesting cultural combination as a kid, too.
So my dad was Italian Irish from Trenton, New Jersey,
Oh,
which
so like
is
near
a,
me.
yeah, and a very specific kind of like growing up. And he grew up, right after the Depression. His father was a shoemaker, et cetera, et cetera. He was the first person to go to college in his family, and he went when he was 16. So as soon as he got out of college, the first thing he wanted to do was get away, excuse me, but get away from New Jersey. And so he went to Hawaii. My mom was Japanese American. She was third generation American, but she was born in LA right after Pearl Harbor and right before they started rounding up the Japanese American citizens and their families and putting them in these incarceration camps. So she was born, and then a month later, she was in the Santa Anita racetrack in a horse stall. And then she spent the first 4 or so years in this camp with her grandmother, who was a Japanese picture bride and spoke no English. So she grew up speaking only Japanese. And then when they got out of camp, the family decided to be hyper American, and then she stopped knowing Japanese. So the family, my mom's side of the family moved to Hawaii, where her dad had family. And so she grew up in a very kind of multiracial, very loose Hawaiian culture. So the family was Japanese-ish, and my dad was Italian-ish, but they got together in Hawaii. And I think for her, he was, he was like this, he had been a model, and he was a crew coach, and he was 3 years older than her. So he was like a big guy. And she was just this like tiny Japanese, like free spirit with a 19-inch waist. And so they had kind of a love affair. And I think that for me, the culture of growing up was more Hawaii, if
Mm-hmm.
nothing else. And at that time, there, since there's a strong sovereignty movement, there's a whole set of Hawaiian schools now for people with that ethnic background, and there's a strong effort to recapture both the culture and the language, which was almost gone. But when I was growing up, it was much more of a, there's Japanese and Chinese and Filipino and Portuguese and some whites you call haole, and that's about it. And everybody was kind of like a mix of something, and everybody was somebody's cousin. And all the doors were open, so you just kind of wandered into somebody's house and yelled for them to see if they were there. Sometimes just waited for them to come back, or left whatever you meant to leave, like your extra papayas, or took whatever you wanted. So that was more the culture I grew up in.
Wow.
Hmm.
That just it sounds probably more idyllic than it was, but maybe it was pretty idyllic. I don't know.
I mean, it was small. And I think in the beginning, and as a kid, that was great because, there's for a long time, there was one road with one lane, so people kind of like pulled off to the side as they passed each other. So there was really not a lot that you could do to get into trouble. So we kind of had the run of the place. But then when I got older, I was living in a small town that probably had maybe 1,000 people when I moved there, and maybe 5 when I left. I don't know. But it was a small enough town, and then within that town, my parents both worked at this boarding school. So that was a very small town within the small town. So everybody knew who you were. Everybody knew who you're supposed to be with and who you are with and whether you're supposed to be there. And so it became, you know, lovely in some ways, but way, way, way too small and
Mm-hmm.
stifling. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen pretty easily.
Yeah.
So it must have been a heck of a shock to you at 30 to find out about the internment.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that maybe when I was in eighth grade or something like that, people had mentioned it, but the idea that my family was was put into these camps and that we hadn't really studied it, and the I try to say this in a nice way, but basically the country just didn't acknowledge it, and that there
Right.
was this narrative of, you know, Americans are the good guys, and they're always the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
And then, later on, as I was studying like the Japanese American experience in the war, I encountered Hiroshima and the bombing, and there too, the Americans were the good guys, and we're always like saving lives and doing good. And then you realize that at the same time, there's all these things that are not so good
Yeah.
that you kind of have to hold in this almost disassociative state, really, to say, yes, Americans are the good guys and Pledge of Allegiance and blah, blah, blah. And my mother was stripped of her citizenship at 1 month old because she was an enemy. And, these entire 120,000 people who were incarcerated in these camps, there everything was basically taken away from them. They were given supposedly a week to sell everything that they had except for what they could
Oh,
carry, and
Lordy.
and go in to this place where they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know how long they were going to be gone. There was not really a reason to actually think that they would lose their homes, lose their farms, all this sort of stuff. And a lot of times they lost them to back taxes because they couldn't pay the taxes because they were in these camps and they couldn't make any money.
Right.
Um, so like it was a big deal, and it was something that when I learned about it, I learned because the United States government had finally decided to apologize and pay reparations. The reparations were $20,000 to every person who was still alive, which was only about half of them at that point, which is not a whole lot of money when you
Right.
consider, what happened to them. Um, and then that was supposed to sweep it all under the rug. And so as I was trying to wrap my head around this stuff that happened and the number of people and the scope of it, I just kept running into, well, it's over, well, we made the best of it, well, we got the apology, et cetera, all this kind of like sweeping it under the rug. And I kept trying to like lift the rug, and it kept getting moved and swept under. So I think that was really more than just finding out about it. I think that the thing that really kind of got me going with the story was not finding out, like trying to find out, like digging for, like, why is this a secret? Why is no one talking about it? Who are the players in the story, and why do they not quite add up? And I started talking to a number of people because my family wasn't really talking. And then I was hearing all of these stories from their families about family secrets, and children who got conveniently like moved to the grandparents' house and out of the family, or marriages that conveniently disappeared. So that was fascinating too. This idea that there was not just a secret because of trauma. There's not just a secret because of guilt and this feeling of self-worth, but
Mm-hmm.
also this secret of like, well, that was a good chance to like make up a switch, and then we want to go forward from there. But there was always this thing of like, let's go forward from here. And I think that for me, besides just like, no, yeah, I need to know because that's how my brain works. It was also this sense of, there's a part of me that is the result of all of this stuff that I don't know about. It's
Right.
like the way that I learned to be a person, is partly how, influenced by my mother, and that's going to be influenced by her fears and her opportunities, and you go down the line, so you have all of this inheritance that you didn't even know came from something. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at, is like, what does this mean for me?
Yeah. I can't quite fathom how you wouldn't have to do something to figure out what it means and try to put the pieces together. Is that why you decided to write the book from multiple points of view?
Yes, absolutely. Because it was like, I was this detective. I was like trying to figure out what happened in some of these stories. So I was creating a family that had like this central question of like, it's not a secret because it kind of happens in the first chapter, but this woman basically gives up a child. She has 2 children. She takes one, she leaves one. And then this like lingering question of, why did she do it? And these are questions that don't get answered, and a lot of times when you find out something like that happens in your family, either no one's going to tell you, or that person has already passed before people will talk, and then nobody actually knows. So you have to kind of decide the best that you can for yourself about what story you can live with, and so that's kind of what I was trying, what I was mimicking. And I stopped myself there and took out the word trying, because I don't even know how consciously I was trying. I was just kind of following, well, if this person knows this and this person knows that, but this empty hole was really interesting to me. And that's what it's about. And it's also interesting because when I finally had a draft, and I was very unsure of my draft because I didn't know how to write a book, because I never studied how to write a book. But I took it to an editor that I loved and trusted at Knopf, where I had worked, and she read it and she said, the story that's interesting is the missing story. The story of, why did this woman leave her child? And you should just scrap this whole thing and write her story. And I was like, that is exactly not what I want to do. Maybe it's interesting to you, and maybe that's because I didn't answer the question. But yeah, the whole idea was to leave it to each character, and then ultimately to the reader, to make your peace with something.
So how did you end up deciding that? I'm trying to figure out the right way to formulate this question. I mean, obviously you decided not to take that advice, but how did you, since you didn't really have any idea how to put a book together, end up taking it from that point until you could get it published? Did you find somebody who got what you were trying to do and work with them at all? Or did you just kind of press on your own?
Well, for starters, let me just say that, because I didn't know how to put a book together, I just picked up a book that I liked, and I read it, and I mapped it out, and I said, okay, Bastard Out of Carolina was the book. This is how Dorothy Allison put this book together. This is where you start. This is where this gets introduced. This is where this twist happens. This is how you finish a chapter. Like, I didn't even understand. And here I am driving across the country, completely unable to put a book down. And yet I didn't understand that there was a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter, so that you wouldn't put it down. Like, it's a device. They teach it in school. But I didn't know that until I really took this book apart and thought, oh, okay, so that's how I put the book together. So, I got myself to that point. And I also found, in the very, very early stages, like the first year or so of its formation, a group called the Asian American Writers Workshop. And it was put together, I think there were 6 of us. We met in the storeroom of A magazine, which is now defunct, so that we could all just kind of sit around a table and read each other's stuff. And that was really helpful, mostly just in the having people understand the kind of the culture and the norms of the people that you were writing about. So I did get some help from friends there, and we definitely workshopped things, but they were all pretty new to writing themselves. I mean, we were all just kind of trying to figure out how it worked. Yeah, I kind of kept shuffling it around and I had these 4 threads running from the beginning of the person's story to the end of the person's story. And the thing about that, as you could probably already guess, is that the ending is more interesting than the beginning. So, if you have 4 beginnings, you're kind of slogging through a lot of like setup. And I think I had somebody who said, well, why don't you turn one of these around? And that really like kind of blew my mind, because then for one of these stories starts at the end and runs through. And then I had to really jigger the puzzle together to say, like, so how do I work with these reveals so there's not too much revealed, but there's still that sort of emotional call and response. And I think that was really helpful. But I think it was mostly just I knew what I wanted it to do. I knew what I wanted it to say. I knew how I wanted it to land and what I didn't want. I think, and that years later I became a teacher, and that was one of the things that I still really talk to writers that I still work with about, is just like making sure that when you get advice, you're not just flailing around and saying, oh, you want it to be this? All right, I'll make it this. Oh, you want it to be that? Oh, you didn't get that? I'll just like fill this whole thing in for you out of your personal interest. You really do have to like hold on to, what am I trying to say? And if they don't get it, then there's something there about making what you're trying to say better. But it's not, there's that line between what the world thinks in all of your different readers, what it could be and what you want it to be.
Sure. But can I just say that I am absolutely amused at the fact that you essentially created yourself a Goddard program in order to figure out how to write this book.
And years before, like this was in the, let's see, that first book was published in I was writing it in the 90s. I think it was published in 1999. So it was the middle 90s when I was just teaching myself how to write. So years later, as you just said, I was hired to teach it at Goddard. I was hired to teach in a Master's of Creative Writing program, having never taken a writing class, let alone having a degree. But Goddard was all about how your life experience can be equivalent to your classroom experience. And I had basically done the Goddard program for myself. I read all the books. I looked at them. I took them apart. I learned from them. I figured out how to answer all my questions. Like, how do you punctuate dialogue? It's, if you're just reading, you probably don't like think that through.
Right.
But like really having to look at something and say, how do you transition in time? All of these sorts of things. I taught myself how to do them. And then when I was hired at Goddard, I hadn't really taught before other than a couple of little workshops here and there. So the way that I kind of taught myself to teach was also the beauty of the program, because it's really an individualized, you and I work together, on your project, and I help reflect back to you things that you could maybe amplify or point out to the things that you're really good at, whatever those, but it's all about question and answer. So what I learned was I learned what I knew when people asked me a question that I could answer. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, that is right. I do know that. And like, record that for myself. That's how you do that. But, it was all in my head. I had taught myself, but I didn't have like words and names and a curriculum and a syllabus for it. So it was really my students and my advisees showing me their work so we could pull it apart together and asking me questions that made me realize how much I knew.
Yeah, this is shining a whole new light on my experience at Goddard, I have
Sorry.
to say.
It's not.
But I mean, it
I
makes
think
so
by
much
the time
sense.
you and I met, I did have a number of years of experience.
Oh, that's not what I mean. Just like the fact that that's where you had come from and how you had figured it out for yourself and how that, came out when we were working together. But, and I'll tell you, I don't know if I ever told you this, but like around the end of that first semester, when I was still teaching, and one of my colleagues had a student paper and said, will you take a look at this for me and tell me what you think? And I said, sure. And I sat down with it for, I don't know, half an hour or whatever it was. And I looked at it when I was done and I was like, Reiko is coming out of my hands onto this kid's paper.
I hope you weren't using a purple pen. No,
I probably was using either purple or green because I never used red. But I mean, I just, before I took it back to her, I just kind of sat there and stared at it for a second. I was like, I was always a pretty good editor, but holy crap, look at what Reiko's done to me in one semester.
Well, I will be proud of that. I just will, because, and it reminds me that when my kids were in high school, they used to have to write papers, and I would talk to them about, like planning out, like, well, what are you going to say and how are you going to start it? And it was sort of a little bit of that kind of brainstorming, but I would let them write it themselves. And then they would bring it to me and they would ask me to look at it. And years later, one of my kids was like, yeah, and it would be all marked up. It would be like all purple. And it was like, I can't even see it anymore. It's so purple. It's like, yeah, well, you know how to write a paper now.
Right. But yeah, all of these questions were just like popping into my head. And I'm like, Reiko, you're in my brain.
Yeah, I'm glad for that. Like I'm multiplying like the mushrooms, right? In The Last of Us. But I do think that, one of the reasons I was able to pick up a book and kind of dissect it, take it into pieces and map it out, my brain just works like that. I have both, I guess, a creative side and a very kind of mathematical, scientific side. And somehow or other, when friends bring problems or people bring projects or I'm working with a student, it's just like I can see it. It's like boop, 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 boop. Okay, you need this. Here's your question. Okay, this is relevant. That's relevant. That's relevant. If you put them together like this, there it is. It's kind of like working with a Rubik's Cube or something, which I can't do. But there's something, it's just very easy for my brain to see the pieces of a story and to see, in the case of a paper, what's there and what's not there, what you forgot to put down.
Yeah. And actually, one of my Goddard friends said something to me one time about like, how is it that, you look at this thing that I can't figure out why it's not working. And in like 5 seconds, you've got, because you need this and you need that and you forgot this and so maybe that's why.
Yeah, maybe that's why we worked together so well, because you have that kind of brain as well.
Yeah. Wow. So you got the book published and it won a pretty big award.
The American Book Award.
Yeah. I mean, that must have been kind of mind-boggling since you'd never done any of this before.
It was, but also I didn't know any different. It's like I found my agent by doing the thing that, they tell you to do, which is read books that you love by, are similar to yours and find out who is their agent and write to them. So I found her pretty quickly. I think she was like the 4th or 5th person I queried.
Wow.
And she had Sandra Cisneros and Julia Alvarez and Lois Ann Yamanaka and all these women who are writing these multi-voiced kind of historical, sagas. And she took it. And the second, she sent it out in 2 submissions. The second submission, they took it. And then she submitted it for an award and it won. And I was just sort of like, oh, well, maybe this is how it works. Like, that seems pretty good to me. And then the second book and the third book, I ran into a world where it was like, oh no, that is not how it works at all. Yeah, but I just kind of thought, well, people are interested in the book, which was great. There was a lot of press at the time, because it was still one of the first books about the incarceration. There was Farewell to Manzanar that, everybody read it maybe in school, or, it was for a younger audience. And then there was Snow Falling on Cedars, which I ended up with 6 copies of or something, because every time somebody found it, they'd be like, oh, you should read this. I was like, yeah, thanks. I'm not going to read it till my book is done, but I'll put it with a stack. But really, other than that, there wasn't anything that was just really for adults that was like historically accurate and really researched. So a lot of people came to me to kind of ask me to share history, to help to fill in that gap. So I did. I feel like for 2 years, I was just being interviewed and asking, being asked questions and writing, essays and articles and stuff like that. And then at the end of the 2 years, it just disappeared, which is interesting. Yeah, because I didn't know that was going to happen either. Like I didn't know how any of it was going to work. Yeah, publishing is an interesting beast.
It is. And I will say that, I read your book, I think right before graduation, in that lovely gap where I didn't have to read anything for Goddard and I could finally read something for me. And I was so grateful to read it because I knew so little about it. I mean, it was definitely one of those moments where I was like, yeah, I mean, I think maybe there was like a sentence in a history book one time, maybe a small paragraph, and that was it. And as I read it, I was just so totally horrified. I mean, I knew it couldn't have been a good thing, but still the degree was just like, good Lord. So, I can imagine that lots of people had lots of questions because, as you say, it was like this big national secret. Like, nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I have always, again, do I put the word tried in here or not? But something that's always been really important to me in my writing is to not just take these things that people don't know about, because I've also written about the atomic bombing. I've written about a tsunami in Hawaii that nobody seems to know about. It's not just to let people know they existed, but it's really to have readers understand the consequences. And in order to really understand the consequences, for me, it's like the human consequences. So I have to put them in a human body. So that book was perhaps difficult to read because the main characters are suffering. The second book, which was actually a memoir where I went to Japan and I was talking to the survivors of the atomic bombing, was really hard to read because I didn't know what the bomb did to people. And that's because the United States government had confiscated all the film and all the pictures and classified all of the information. They didn't want anybody to know, because then people would have been rightfully horrified, and then there wouldn't be an atomic, like a whole nuclear arsenal. And I really resisted that. So in my memoir, and then in my most recent book, Shadow Child, which is the novel that I wrote out of the material I was getting when I was doing my research in Japan, I was really clear that I was going to make this real. And I wanted people to kind of squirm in a way. I was hoping that I could capture them with the story and make them love the characters and then make them squirm. But I do think one of the reasons why my books have a certain audience, but not an enormous audience, is because they are hard to read. it's like, oh my God, this really happened. Oh my God, this is the effect. This is. But I think that that's one of the most important things for me in deciding to write.
Well, and I think if you're going to write about that kind of thing, you're doing everyone a disservice if you try to gloss over it. And I also think that fiction is one of the best ways to make it real to someone.
Mhm,
You know,
mhm,
if you were just writing an essay about it or a
mhm,
nonfiction book, it wouldn't hit the same way
mhm.
at all.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. In my nonfiction book, I ended up, I was living in Japan. I had gotten a government grant to go and live there and interview the survivors of the atomic bomb for what turned out to be my third book. Um, and I was doing research, and I was trying to get like people to tell me what happened, and really that those kinds of tactile details about what did something feel like, what did something look like, what was the temperature, what was the this, what was the that. And I was having a really hard time getting people to answer those questions, partly because, it had been many years. I think it had been maybe 60 by then,
Mm-hmm.
um, maybe 55. But they didn't want to remember themselves. And
Sure.
so it was, in thinking about like if that had been a nonfiction book and that had just stayed the way it was, it would have been hard because I would have gone to the facts, but I wouldn't have been able to get the personal details and really like flesh out the stories because they
Mm-hmm.
just didn't, they couldn't hold them. They were too painful to hold. But what happened for me, what happened in the world, um, was that I was there for 3 months before September 11th, and I was there for 3 months after September 11th. And the 3 months before, it was really, really hard to get those stories. And then when September 11th happened, it really shattered the people in Japan because they had like survived by creating this narrative that they were peace activists and they were telling their story to kind of to ensure world peace, and that the people in their lives and their entire community, all of the sacrifices and all of the destruction, all of the death was sacrificed for world peace. And then all of a sudden there's no world peace, and they're looking at the United States that's going in and bombing Afghanistan because of September 11th, and they're going, wait a second, like what is the connection here? Except that these
Mm-hmm.
are, um, this is a civilian population. They're indoctrinated. They're starving. They didn't do it, and you're
Right.
dropping bombs on them, and that kind of like blew their minds, and that opened up story for them that let all of these memories come back with all of the kind of like unbearable detail that I was looking for and needed, if I was going to write fiction. And and for them at that moment, they couldn't manage the memories. And so I had been there for 3 months, and they kind of knew me by then. I've been like pounding on doors saying, please, will you talk to me? And they'd be going, oh, it's too hot. But then all of a sudden they started calling me because I became a kind of a lockbox where they could pick that up and they could share it. They didn't have to tell their families. They didn't have to be that person who suffered that thing for the rest of their lives by like sharing it in their space. They could give it to me. They could trust that I was going to do something with it in another language they were never going to read. And I would go away and I could like take their burden. And so in that case, I did, I think, get some really incredible detail into a nonfiction book that I never would have been able to get if world events had not unfolded the way they did.
Sure. And there's still stories of people, so it kind of has
Mm-hmm,
that in common with fiction, even though
mm-hmm,
it's not
mm-hmm,
just a dry textbook.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah,
It must have been absolutely amazing to watch that shift happen.
it was. And there was a time, and then I mean, one. So the grant that I had was funded by the Japanese government and the American government, the National Endowment for the Arts. And because there was Japanese government money, I was always interesting to TV reporters. So, August 6th comes around and they're all following me, when the peace ceremony and everything was happening. After 9/11, they came to me again and they started following me to my interviews. And there was one interview probably in December of that year where I went and I was talking to this older couple, and I had a friend of mine who was a translator there, and they had lost, and there was a TV crew. They had lost two sons who were 5 and 7, and I had two sons back in Brooklyn, like watching the paper fall out of the sky after 9/11, who were 3 and 5. And they were talking about, and there was a picture of these two boys, like there's a painting above their heads. And they were talking about what happened that day. And they had left the boys and they were supposed to go to their grandmother's house. And, they got hit. And I think one of them tried to save the other one. And then they both died. And the father was responsible for taking the bodies to be cremated. And there were so many bodies that not all of them burned. So there were there was parts of a leg or something. Like there was parts of the bodies that were not cremated. And he said, I couldn't tell my wife. She could not have bared it. And I realized, even through the fact that my friend Keiko is doing the translation stuff, that as he tells me that, she's hearing it for the first time. He's never told her this. And he is weeping and she is weeping. And I'm thinking about my boys and I'm thinking about 9/11 and I'm weeping. And there's a TV crew. It's just taking the whole thing. We finally had to kind of send the TV crew away so we could just be together. But that moment of just holding space for the fragility of these children, and the horrible sorrow when something like that happens. And it just was amazing. And I don't think that there are many, I can't think of many nonfiction books that you can write about that level of an experience, unless it's your own personal memoir. You could dive into it for that, but just about what's going on for somebody else. It's I felt a real responsibility to get that out into the world. And so even though I had gone there to do interviews for a novel that I was going to write, which I did eventually publish many years later, I realized that I had to write a memoir about what was happening there, because I needed these stories to come out to honor these people the way that they were, in their truth, instead of just grinding them up into some kind of fictional mix and throwing them into another book. So they actually came out in the memoir, and then I obviously pulled on that material for the novel as well. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And somewhere in all of this, you were teaching too.
I loved teaching. I loved teaching, and I still kind of teach. I still do creative coaching and working with individuals. And I just said yes to a visiting professorship at City College in New York in the CUNY system. I'm going to be doing a fiction workshop for their MFA program in the fall, because I just, get 12 writers around a table again and talk about their work. It's just a really fun thing for me. But I am energized, I think, by teaching, because of what I said to you. We get to look at this material, and we get to pull it apart, and we get to think about what if this and what if that. And there's a nugget here that's really shiny and really something that, wants to be born. And, when I first started teaching, because I was a new teacher, I was working with like people's questions, like, how do I do this? And I'd be like, well, you do it this way. And in a way, in the very beginning, I thought that, well, teaching someone how to write is about those mechanics. It's about those rules. Like, well, this is how you punctuate. This is how you do this. This is what the plot generally looks like. It's not what your plot has to be, but you should know what the plot generally looks like, so you can break, the rules deliberately if you want to. And then at some point, I just realized that the best teaching that I think that I did, and probably still do, is just about helping someone see what they have in their hand. And so they can own it, they can figure it out, and they can respond to it and bring that story into the world. Because if you get that story down and somebody has to go through and fix your punctuation, that's not the hard part. The hard part is like that urgency for like that story that only you can tell. If I'm teaching in a master's program, yes, you do have to punctuate. I'm not saying that, but and so there was a little bit of a hybrid there. But the part of the teaching that I love, that's really exciting, is that part of like what do we have here? What's being birthed into the world, and what does it mean, and how does that connect to, you might be writing something about, just talking to someone about a book that's sort of set in the world of AI, social media, young adults, something like that. And it's like, yeah, and look at how that connects to, fake news, and look at that, how that connects to this, and look at how like our society is separating in this way, and see how your story, and then it's like, oh my God, that thing that's like fascinating me in my head is connected to everything, because that's the thing, right? We are all connected. And the stories that I think really pop are the stories that people read it and it touches them because it touches something that's going on in their lives. It doesn't have to be like, oh, this is a story about adoption and my dad was adopted. But, it's just like, yes, that separation. Yes, that loneliness. Yes, that desire. Yes, that terrible choice. And that's the thing that I really love to kind of nurture and play with. And so being able to help writers get there, that's just energizing to me.
Sure. And I'm remembering the day that I think it was the third packet back from you, which was when I was still believing that I was ever going to be capable of writing short stories and enough of them to get a diploma. and my dad's mother was busy dying, and so totally like distracting from everything. And I had this bit of a short story that I had actually started like a month before Goddard, just because I hadn't written anything for a while. And I decided that was my backup story, that if something happened and I couldn't get everything else done because grandma was, that's what I would send in.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing I ever expected to hear was, first of all, this is not a short anything, which I believe were your exact words, because they were tattooed on my brain.
Well,
and then
stand by that.
and then the words, this would be a great thesis if you wanted to do that. And I'm like, that means I have to totally shift gears, and oh God. And I had to stop and think about it for a couple days before I was like, yeah, sure. Cause I probably can't write that many short things anyway, cause this is not a short anything.
Yeah. Well, that definitely wasn't a short anything, but I think, there's a difference between being a creator and being in a program where you have to do a certain thing in a certain way by a certain time. Right. And that was always the tension there. But I do think that when you have a story that it's just time for that story, you're connecting to it in a certain way. The urgency is there. The passion is there. Like, you're in that world. It's not that it writes itself, because it doesn't, but the way forward has a flow to it. You can get to that flow. And it will go. Whereas something else, if you're like, yeah, but I've got 6 short stories already and I just need 3 more, I don't know what to write, but maybe this. There's just no flow. There's just
Yeah,
no way forward. And then you're just struggling, and it could take you longer, and it could just
sure.
not be as good. So I do think that when you when I hear, sometimes I talk to people who are like, well, I know I'm supposed to finish this one because it's almost done, but I really want to write this one. It's like, at least
You
get
need
that
to
one
go write
out.
that one.
You
Yeah.
need to go write that one. And even if what you need to do is that there's a bunch of stuff that's built up in your head about it, and you just get that part out, and then the block is gone, and then you can go finish this. Because some people can, juggle multiple things in their head. I am not so good at that. Um, but yeah, there's no point in struggling against
Right.
creativity,
Right.
and imagination.
Totally agree with that. So I'm curious to know what it was like for you to be at a place like Goddard and be around all of these other writers who were also teaching, especially since you hadn't taught before, but even over time.
What it was like to be with the other faculty.
Mm-hmm. To be in
I
that
mean,
environment.
I mean, it was one of the best, definitely the best job of my life, and I mean, I loved my students, and I loved teaching, but I went back year after year for the faculty, and we got together, and we were friends, and we supported each other, and we listened to each other's readings. When I went there the first time, because I didn't really know. I mean, I had given a couple of workshops, so I knew that I could give the workshops and kind of lectures that I was signed up for. But I hadn't really, like, I didn't have a lot of writing prompts and exercises from my advising group. So I went and asked one of my colleagues, like, in this very suave way, what is your favorite writing exercise for the first day? And she gave me a bunch of ideas, and then I went to Deborah Vivort's plot workshop, like, which was about, she's a playwright, but she was talking about the dramatic clock. And I was like, oh, hey, I have a dramatic clock in my memoir. I'm going to use it. Like, I didn't even know that. And then I went to Rebecca Brown's workshop on one of Michael Ondaatje's really kind of beautiful fragmented books. And she went through the whole plot in this really interesting way. I went to Rachel Pollack's Tarot for Writers workshops. The first time I had ever encountered tarot, changed my life. Like, a big part of what I do now is tarot. But they were all so generous in just letting me sit there, letting me absorb, showing me what they did. And they were always like really supportive and really, everybody was just kind to everybody else. So one of the reasons that I got my memoir published, because I had an agent who, I'm just going to say, was not able to find a
Mm-hmm.
publisher for the book. Rebecca was like, I have this friend, she used to publish me, and we brought her in as a visiting professional, and she said, you're going out to dinner with me, and Amy, and you're going to tell her about your book. And I was like, so Amy said, so what are you working on now? And even though the book was finished, I just started telling her about the book because that's what Rebecca had told me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, you should send it to me. And I did. And she was, I mean, that was a fantastic experience. But like, I found her because one of my colleagues, it was incredible. I mean, you would think perhaps that there would be some kind of competition, among big name writers. There was never anything like that. There was just support.
Well, and that's what it was like for us too.
Mm.
Among ourselves as students, but also with faculty. I don't remember ever. Okay, I may have heard one story where there was an issue, but for the most part, we would sit around the table at dinner and like hash through what we were writing for advising group the next morning.
Mhm.
Or, I'm trying to do this with my book and it's not working. And what do you
Mhm.
guys think? Because,
Mhm.
we'll see what Reiko thinks, but we'll see what you think, and
Absolutely. The more the merrier. Yeah.
whatever. And it was just not like what I was afraid of when I first thought about
Mhm.
applying for an MFA program. I
Mhm.
thought this is going to be one of these things where you just get slashed to pieces in a workshop every day,
Mhm.
and I'm not interested in spending a whole lot of money for that.
Right.
And Goddard was just never ever like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because that just stunts you, and I mean that's not good for you. I mean
No.
that's the thing that you know immediately, um, as a even as a first day teacher, that if you if you can help someone see what they need to do, then you've helped a writer. If you tell them what to do or you tell them that they've done it wrong, what have you done? I mean, I'm there to help somebody finish a full length manuscript of acceptable publishable quality in 2 years while reading 45 books and doing a teaching practicum, right? There is no time and no room for me giving you writer's block. That's just not.
Right. And you're probably working a day job at the same time, too.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But if I can teach you how to teach yourself, how to answer your own questions, how to read your own work, if you can't read your own work, how to read the books on your shelves so that you can remember, what you need to do, then you have lifelong skills and you have lifelong teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it works. So,
I'm glad.
Ah, God, I miss Goddard.
Mm.
So, what are you working on now? I mean, you said you have this workshop coming up for City University, but what else is going on?
So I have that, which I'm excited about, and I do some, creative coaching. I do some uh, book readings with the tarot. Like I do brainstorming with people using the tarot to help them sort through their books, which has been fascinating and really rewarding. Um, because I think the way that I work with tarot, which might be familiar to you since Rachel Pollack is the person who taught me everything that I know about tarot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like she always said that the tarot tells you what you already know. And that's perfect for a book because the writer is coming in, they know everything. They just can't access it. So I do a lot of that. I have two manuscripts that I have been struggling with for a while. One is done, and I think it was maybe before its time and it needs some work, and it's a possibly young adult fantasy, which is brand new to me, and I had to teach myself how to write it. I think it's still stuck in the world building stage a little bit too much. And the other one is a memoir about my parents. Um, I'm calling it the Garage Mahal. My mother, my mother had dementia. She got dementia when she started losing her mind when she was 55, and she
Oof.
died when she was 68. And during those 13 years, my dad took care of her. Um, and one of the things that he did as she started to kind of lose her memories is that they on every Saturday they would go to a garage sale, and he would buy things, and people would give her like plastic bead necklaces and various things. And um she loved blue glass, so there was a lot of it in the house. Anything blue. He bought her a blue car at one point because it was on the side of the road, and she said mine, and it was only $4,000. So literally there was a part of the underside of the car that was zip tied together. But he bought it and put it in the front yard so she could point to it. But so by the time he passed away, there were 5 buildings on the property that were full of, like, he just went crazy at the garage sales. So it's kind of like about Alzheimer's and love and hoarding and a certain kind of slice of America, caregiving and loss. And I've been working on that for a long time. I do it in a spurt, and then I put it down for months, and then I think, do I really want to write this? And then I go and I do another spurt. It's a hard one for me because I think it changes every time I go back to it. Like in the beginning, I thought this is a love story, and then I thought God, I hate my father sometimes. And then that was hard to write a love story from. And then it's like, well, is it about the two of us? And I think it's still like shifting. And I haven't quite figured out what it is. My father used to send us emails called the garage sale find emails. So every week we would hear all the stuff that he picked up.
Oh, wow.
But then we would have pictures of my mother, so we knew that she was okay and she was happy. And then there would always be some stories. Like one year he picked up a model Jaguar XK140, which was the car that he had when he met my mother. And then I was conceived a couple months after they were married. So he had to get rid of the car because it was a two-seater. So when I showed up, he had to get rid of the car. So that was like the first bad thing I did. But he told this story about like the car and like times from their courtship. So embedded in all of these garage sale finds emails are all of these stories of their courtship. So he was giving us the memories as well. So there's this whole thing about memories and found and missing and intangibility and tangibility. And yeah, so I'm working on that too.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll be curious to see that one when you finish it. When, not if.
When. You want to give me a deadline?
You know, the biggest surprise to me of being at Goddard was that deadlines are absolutely magic.
Yeah.
I had no idea before then, but there were so many packets when I was like, you know, I had 10 days left and I'm going, it's never going to happen. There's no way I could possibly get all of this done. And somehow it always did. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't necessarily even tell you how it happened, but it happened. Mm-hmm. So I'm just saying.
Yeah. No, it's true. You do need, and this is the thing that I'm struggling with because it's the thing that I know to do. I have done it before successfully. I'm not doing it right now. And I'm just like noticing that I'm not doing it. You need to open the portal. You need to have the practice of saying, I am here, showing up. And sometimes it comes through easily, but if you keep on practicing that, it starts to come through regardless. But I think that as much as there might be, a higher self or a story sitting there, or, however you think about where stories come from for you, if you're not open, it's not going to come. It's just going to wait behind the door. And I think that that's the thing with me in this book about my parents. It's like I'll go in and I'll do a bunch of writing and I come out and I kind of close the door. It's like I'm not sure if it's that yet. And so I'm just going to kind of sit back and wait. So that's what the deadlines give you. It's like, oh, damn, I have to get 4 pages, 10 pages, whatever it is, this day, this hour, this week.
Yeah.
I have to go there. So it's that like it takes away your resistance to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Though it never felt to me like, oh, I have to sit down and I have to write 5 pages that I could recall. It was just like, okay, I'm going to do this now, and somehow, like I said, magic, because stuff was just suddenly there. And I was like, oh, look, I'm done. Time to go to the post office.
Yeah. Well, you also had a 2-year container. That's the thing. It's like you had to have it done. And the more time you spend on short stories, the less time you have to do it.
Which is why it's good that I sent that story in the 3rd packet and not the 5th one.
Yeah. A lot of people who didn't find their material till the end of the first semester ended up with another semester. But yeah, I mean, I think the pressure is always there when you have that kind of deadline. Mm-hmm. And so maybe at a certain point you get used to it, you're writing every day, and then the portal is just always open.
Yeah. Whatever it is, I've never forgotten that. It's like, no, when people tell me, deadlines freak me. I'm like, okay, but deadlines are actually your friend. Mm-hmm. If you don't let them get all up in your head, they're totally your friend. Things will get done like by magic if you respect the deadline. If I try to set a deadline for myself, that I will totally blow off because it's just for me. Right. But, so it's like, it needs to be a credible deadline. It needs to be set somehow or with someone that you don't want to disappoint.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the reasons why co-writing spaces work. Like some people, especially during COVID, would just say, we're going to make a date. We're going to get on Zoom. You're going to write. I'm going to write, but we're going to be on Zoom. And I might be over here. You may or may not see me, but I know you're there. And that helps you stay in the chair.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about holding space that's what this time is for. That is a little miracle worker too. Yep. Well, I really have loved this conversation because it has given me a whole new view on Goddard. but also just to, get a chance to see what you've been up to and where you came from and all that kind of good stuff. So thanks for coming and talking with me.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for having me.
That's this week's show. Thanks so much to Rahna Reiko Rizzuto and to you for listening. Please leave a review for this episode. There's a link in your podcast app. And in it, tell us about a time when a need to understand something changed your life. If you enjoyed our conversation, I hope you'll share it with a friend. Thanks so much. If this episode resonated with you, don't forget to get in touch on any of my social platforms or even via email at nancy@fycuriosity.com and tell me what you loved. And if you're feeling a little bit less than confident in your creative process right now, and you haven't yet signed up for my free email series on 6 of the most common creative beliefs that are messing you up, please check it out. It'll untangle those myths and help you get rolling again. You can find it at fycuriosity.com, and there's also a link right in your podcast app. See you there, and see you next week. Follow Your Curiosity is produced by me, Nancy Norbeck, with music by Joseph McDade. If you like Follow Your Curiosity, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. It really helps me reach new listeners. Thanks.